First of all, the purpose of this session. As I understand it, some of you are going to be leading online peer support groups. And actually, some of the field educators are also going to be leading groups, but they're slightly different. And what I thought we would do for the time we have is sort of do it in two parts. Part one would be to take a look at the general principles about leading groups, mutual aid support groups, whether it's peers, whether it's client groups that you're leading. There are certain general dynamics and principles that we ought to take a look at. And then there are specific elaborations that are different. For example, you're not a supervisor, you're not a field educator, most of you. You're not a teacher in a classroom, you're a peer. So what's the difference when you're leading a support group and you're a peer of the people who are members of the support group? We should look at that. Also, this is a very powerful and difficult time. And so you're also going to be leading support groups when you're struggling with some of the same issues that the members of the group are struggling with. You know, very clear. And in fact, a few of you sent me some emails describing what those issues are, and that was very helpful for my tuning into this session. So part one, how do we lead groups? How do we get them started? How do we make them clear? And how do we lead them when we're a peer of the person? We're not somebody who has a position of authority. And how do we lead a group when we're struggling with the very same issues day in and day out? So let me just stop. Is that clear? And I can see your faces, so you can shake your heads if you want, you know, or go that way if you want, you know, either way, just to get a sense. Part two, I thought, when I was thinking about the session, what we could do is take the principles from part one and then apply them. And we could do a little role play right here. A couple of you could take opportunity to lead this group as if this was the group that you're going to be leading of your peer students. Am I making sense on that? And we could try it out. It's called rehearsal. And we could see what goes well, what doesn't go well, how could you do it differently. So part one, lay out the principles, the dynamics, the strategies, the unique stuff that is unique to a peer support group. And then part two, practice it and see what it sounds like. So that's my idea about the purpose of this. How does that sound to the rest of you? Would that be useful? Anybody? And if you want to say something or comment, you know, either raise your hand. Can they unmute themselves, Laura, if they want? Yeah, so you could, you know, feel free to jump in. As best as possible, I'd like to make this more interactive and less my talking and, you know, you're just watching. I've been doing this for a couple of days now. One of the things you have to watch out because of overlapping, you know, you're starting to speak, someone else is still speaking, so that could be difficult. If it becomes a problem, we can raise hands. So what's my role? I'm going to present some key concepts, and then I'm going to treat this as a support group, a mutual aid support group for people who are doing field education, but also students who are volunteering to work with fellow students. So that I will be leading this in the way I believe we ought to be leading mutual aid support groups. And at the end of the 2 hours, we'll leave a little time and we can talk about how did this group go, the session that we're in right now, and how did I do as a leader, and what could I have done differently, and what are you taking away as important ideas? So in a sense, our session itself is modeling the very thing we're talking about. If I do a good job, I ought to practice what I preach. And you ought to be able to see that. If I make mistakes, we can learn from that as well. You know, because we're always learning from mistakes if we're skillful. So that's part of what I'm going to be doing. I'll share my own ideas, address your questions and concern, and encourage you to jump in. Now, I do want to mention something about confidentiality. This is being recorded, and I think I really have to ask everyone who's participating if they're okay with the recording. Laura wanted to record it because she felt it might be useful for other groups, could be useful for other schools. But before, you know, we go ahead, I want to make sure there is an agreement on the issue of confidentiality, which, by the way, is also something you're going to have to do with your peer support groups when you lead them. Anybody have an issue with that or a problem? You can't say so if you do. And Laura, is it possible if after the session there's a piece that people have shared that they'd rather not share, you can still edit?
Absolutely.
Okay, so everybody get that. So if there is something afterwards, you would still have the opportunity to come back and say, Laura, can you cut that piece out? You
Sure.
know, it's too personal or whatever.
Okay.
Okay, and let me start by doing what I call problem swapping, trying to identify some of the issues that you may be thinking about as you're getting ready to lead a group. Not the issues that you're struggling with yourself. We'll get to that later, but just the issues around, I'm preparing to lead a peer support group. What are some of the things I'd like to see addressed, during the first hour of this session while we're together? I have a couple that I have some examples. You introduce yourself to your peers. You just got online. That's something that Laura's arranging, so you could do that. You make a little opening statement about the purpose of the group, and you're met with silence. You know what I'm talking about, right? It's the moment when you say to yourself, if you're doing group work in the field, why didn't I bring a film or something to get this going? So that's something. One person starts to describe how hard it's been on them, and they keep talking, and they keep talking, and they don't stop talking. And so now you've got a member of the group that is dominating the group, and because it's online, it's even harder for other people to jump in. So how do I handle it so that everybody has a chance to get in, but I don't be putting down or embarrassing or cutting someone off? That's an issue that comes up often. You're supposed to lead the group discussion, but members seem to ignore you. You have these comments you make, and they just keep on going as if you're not even there. They're not, in effect, responding to you as a group leader, even though that's your job. And by the way, my personal bias is peer support groups are great, but they always need someone who has some responsibility for making sure they work. Just bringing people together and saying you're a support group does not mean it's going to be an effective support group. So that's your job, being the person to help make that work. One member starts to talk about a client issue, and it looks to you like they're using the session for practice supervision. Very important we make clear, as a peer support group leader, you're not there to provide supervision. Some of the field instructors maybe, the field units maybe, and I think Laura and the staff are going to set up other groups am I correct, Laura, to substitute for supervision? So they start to use it for supervision, but it's not appropriate for you as a peer to provide the supervision on the session. They lose sight that this is not supervision, and it's not personal therapy, by the way, either. They lose sight that it's an opportunity for peers to help each other around how do we cope with issues in our life right now that's affecting our ability. And we don't have contacts at the agency. We don't have supervisors. That's really what the purpose is. So one member starts to talk about client issues. Another one talks about how upsetting it's been for him and her family. And there's some elements of that are okay. They're part of what peer support is. But we don't want to turn it into a clinical therapeutic group. That's a mistake. So how do we gently maybe help them figure out if they're having such severe personal and family problems and issues where they can get the help? But a peer support group is not really a therapeutic encounter. Am I making sense on that? Distinguishing the peer support from supervision and distinguishing it from personal therapy. A peer support group shouldn't be doing either of them. One person raises an issue and group members seem to jump in with advice that doesn't seem relevant. You probably have all been in a group like that. Maybe you've led some, where somebody raises something and it actually creates such anxiety that everybody now is going to jump in with advice, how to deal with it. They start to deal with the question being raised by the person before they really know what the question is. And they're giving answers prematurely. Am I still making sense? I'm just throwing some of these out as the most common things that come up. And what I'd like to do is just take a break for a minute from my presenting and just give you a little room, each of you, to describe the things that you're trying to get out of it. Did any of the things I just described hit home? Have you had those experiences in the past when you've led groups? Some of you have done group work, et cetera. What's your version of the problems that I just shared. And I wouldn't mind taking a few minutes for that. And then I'll do a little presentation, and then we'll do some adaptation, etc. But let me start by saying if the examples I was raising was hitting home, or there are other examples. Remember, we will get, before we're finished, to your own individual issues that parallel the issues the other students in your groups are going to be raising. We will talk about those. So I'm just asking to focus now on group leadership issues and what those might be for you. Anybody want to jump in? And I have to let you know, after all these years, I'm very good at waiting.
I'll share something. At my internship, we did groups, and sometimes the patients would get too graphic.
What do you mean by that?
They would go into too much detail about maybe personal things or a subject matter that might trigger someone else.
And if you could remember, and I'll be asking this all during the session, what I'll be asking is, at that moment when you're leading the group and that's happening, Jacqueline, what's it feel like for you? And what's the dilemma that you experience at that moment? Do you understand? Because I think how we feel affects how we act. And we have to be in touch with what's going on in our own emotions if we're going to understand how to intervene and react. So when somebody starts to get that personal or things that might trigger, what's the feeling like for you and what's the dilemma for you?
Well, it gets uncomfortable for me as a group leader because I start worrying about the other patients in the room and how they're feeling. So what we would do would just be to remind the patients about our values that we would go over every day, and what's appropriate and inappropriate in a group setting.
And even if you do, it still comes up.
Yeah.
Right. Somehow we had this idea that if we speak the words, that's all we have to do. And now the group culture has changed, and probably it doesn't. So it's some discomfort. And if you listen to what Jacqueline just said, this will be important as we go along. You got the individual, you got the group. And I have to pay attention to both. And I'm there in the middle. Jacqueline's in the middle. You're all in the middle. You're trying to help individuals reach out to the group, and you're trying to help the group to respond to the individual. And so what Jacqueline is saying, if I heard it correctly, is that sometimes someone might raise something that's so powerful or concerning or could be triggering, et cetera, that at that moment, you feel identified with the group and concerned about them. Am I close? Yeah, and the issue was always, at that moment, who's with the individual? Understand the question I'm going to be raising? We'll look at the example more, because I'm going to argue if you're going to really do an importantly good job at group, you got to be with both. You have to find a way to be emotionally with the individual and the group at exactly the same time. Wonderful start, Jacqueline. It's a crucial issue. Comes up all the time. Someone else jump in.
I think you hit it the first thing that you said, just being met with silence, like that uncomfortable, like getting going and people not participating right away or feeling not comfortable and engaging before someone else does. So I think just being comfortable being met with silence can be intimidating.
And I guess, let me see if I got it, Alexander. Is Alex short for Alexander?
Yeah, Alex works. Thank you.
Okay, Alex, let me see if I got it. There is the issue of the skill, really, of remaining silent in the face of silence. Mm-hmm. And there are times when that's probably an important skill, individual, group, whatever, for us to do. But what happens when the silence continues? And the silence continues. And now it becomes, unfortunately, a battle of wills over who's going to break the silence. Am I making sense? Yeah. So I would argue, Alex, that you're raising a crucial issue. We'll look at it in some of the examples in our role plays. We're going to do that later. But I would argue that the skill of reaching inside the silence is crucial. And reaching inside the silence means trusting your gut, that your gut may be telling you what that silence is speaking. Okay. Everybody quiet right now. Has this hit you hard? Are you thinking about your own experiences right now? And is that why you're all quiet? Do you understand what I'm doing? I am throwing out 2, 3, 4 potential meanings of the silence. So my whole issue around silence has always been, the psychodynamic stuff and the psychotherapy stuff, a psychotherapist could stay silent for 60 minutes and you stay silent. Meanwhile, you're paying $200 for that hour and nobody's talking. So Alex, when we get back to this, I think it's a perfect example. The issue is, how do we reach inside of silences? Because every silence has its own meaning, and those meanings are different. It depends on the group, it depends on the moment, depends on what was just said. So you're on. We'll get back to that. Excellent. That's another good one. How about others? And again, these are the issues that you were concerned about when Laura finally set you up, and you're actually going to be starting to talk to fellow students and trying to help them talk to each other. That's what our first focus is, on issues like that. What else?
I can speak. So I've been doing social work for about 9 years, minus the delay from my car accident, and I've never ran a group. So going into my internship at the holding center, I knew that I would be running, about 10, 15-minute psychoeducational groups to different inmates. And a couple weeks before COVID kind of hit, I started co-facilitating groups with one of the other girls that goes to a different school. And I think my biggest issue that I started with was not knowing what to say and like how to bring it back. So if we got off track, like bringing the group back together and staying focused.
Let's stay with Eden. I think it's another incredibly important issue, co-facilitating. That's what Eden is raising at that point. You ever in a group, how many of you have done groups where you, or family sessions where you co-facilitated, or even individual sessions? You might have done it. Have you ever had a moment in a session like that where you said to yourself, I can't believe she said that, and you're referring to the other leader? Do you understand what I'm raising? Have you ever had a moment where you're saying to yourself, oh my God, she's going off track, but I don't know how to get back on track? I see a head shaking there, Chuck. You know what I'm talking about. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Chuck.
definitely. I took part in co-facilitating some groups for, at the time, it was like addictions counseling. I know the verbiage has changed in the last several years, but very easily groups could get out of control. Refocusing was a critical component. At that time, I didn't have nearly as much experience as I have now, but the anxiety associated with feeling somebody maybe feel invalidated, to not reach in and try to be understanding, still use open-ended questions and try to, help. The group kind of helps itself once it hits that momentum. But those initial phases, especially in early recovery groups, for individuals that are really still suffering and pre-contemplative with their substance use concerns, it's an extremely challenging endeavor for sure.
And I think probably in all the examples we've had thus far, I would think, if my experience is holding true, that often in your gut, you probably feel what you want to say, but you're not sure if it's the right thing to say. Do you know what I mean? Your gut,
Absolutely.
am I close on that, Chuck? Or it could be you, Eden, in an example where you're co-facilitating. So how do we find a way to be open, honest, and spontaneous and still respectful? How do we find a way to differ with a co-leader, for example? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's marvelous in groups, when groups can see co-leaders, two professionals, disagreeing.
Right.
Especially, let's say it's a couples counseling group. Wouldn't that be an interesting idea, to see the male and the female co-leader disagreeing, but in a respectful way? So I think what we'll see, and I'm going to come back to these examples, I think they're excellent. What we'll see is often your gut is right on target, but somehow we've been taught not to trust it. My argument for 40 years in all the books and everything I wrote is that we've been made more mechanical. And that's one of my questions about evidence-based practice, by the way, because sometimes it's taught in a way that's mechanical. What I hear you saying is, what I hear you saying is, and the client says, what, you heard me say that? I wasn't even close. So somehow to be spontaneous and skillful at the same time, to take what I call science of practice, what we've learned from research, and to integrate that with the artistry of practice, the unique way I would do it that really is a reflection of me. Am I making sense on that? I think that's crucial. That's the biggest problem we're facing right now in the field, is that people wanting to be scientific and to use evidence-based practice and evidence-informed practice have often turned it into a mechanical intervention rather than taking out of it what's useful. There's a lot of useful ideas in the research. I use them myself, but shaping them, and then shaping them using my own gut and my own personal artistry. Am I making sense on that? So Eden, did I hear you correctly about the co-facilitator, or did I miss something? Is this making sense?
Yeah, no, I think that you're hitting it. I mean, especially being like a new group leader, sometimes I struggle with, how to co-facilitate and just make sure that we can like keep bringing it back and that we're on the same page. And I just don't want to do that with other peers when I'm running groups.
So say that last one again. You don't want to do this with other people. What does that mean?
Peers, like when we're doing the peer group, I don't want to go in not prepared on like how to bring it back if we co-facilitate.
If you are going to be co-facilitating, one of the issues is always some preliminary contracting with your co-facilitator. Sitting down and talking about things like, well, what if you do have a difference? How do we want to handle it? And finding a way, even before the group starts, to have some agreement. Now, most of you will not be co-facilitating, although some of you might. I don't know, how the setup is going to be, but certainly before I start a group, I would want to sit down with my co-leaders, and I would want to talk about how do we handle it when we disagree, and how do we show disagreement in a respectful but also mature and positive way. I don't want to sit there in the group as in my early practice, I did sit there thinking, God, I don't know why they said that, because I don't think that's helpful and I don't know how to intervene now, and I feel stuck. So I'm getting a pretty good sense of some of your issues. Take another minute and then I'll do a little presentation, and then we'll come back to your examples and talk about what we might have said or done. And then remember, the second half of this is going to be focusing on the problems and issues that your peers are experiencing and that you're experiencing as well. And how would we be helpful to them in those groups? So that'll be the second half. We have time. I'm keeping my eye on the clock. Anything else? So far, you're raising great examples, by the way. These are universal, I'm telling you.
Hi, Larry.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. So I definitely have a kind of question or area of consideration. So I think it sounds like a lot of us here, including myself, have more experience with, if we have group experience, with leading more structured groups. For example, I did some DPT skills training sessions in one of my internships and things like that. And when we're talking about this idea of redirecting people back to a thing, I'm wondering, I have kind of a clarifying question around the purpose of the mutual aid groups we're going to be running. It'll be my understanding that if we are, let's say somebody does start to try to use group as consultation, as a supervision experience, probably unintentionally, my understanding for the purpose of the mutual aid groups would be, we might be able to be trying to tap into how are they coping with that, direct them to the appropriate thing, and maybe loop that into other people's experiences in the group with like pull out similarities in terms of what other people are struggling with as well. Like, are we trying to keep bringing the mutual aid group back to the idea of how are we all coping at this time? Is that kind of the primary function of the mutual aid groups?
So, say a bit more. It's Adriel, right? Say a bit more about the structure versus unstructured, because I was listening to that and then I heard something else.
So I was saying it sounds like a lot of people, including myself, present, have more experience leading structured groups where we have a curriculum, we have sessions versus a process group. I'm getting my toes wet in process group stuff right now, but it's, that's more, it's amazing work, but it's more challenging. And it sounds like the mutual aid thing that we're planning here is more of a process oriented thing, but that we'd be still trying to pull it back when we are trying to redirect, quote unquote, people, that we're trying to redirect back to how are we coping and pulling out material that's going to be useful, either eliciting material from the other group members that will help that person, or the other direction where, we're trying to foment people helping each other and themselves with coping and, avoid things like we're going off into land of turning this into supervision. Does that sound right?
Oh, it sounds absolutely right. Now that I've heard it, and you've given me a wonderful opportunity to say my little speech, okay? I have a number of little speeches that I like to say. If I were to describe this session, if I was to describe my book, my writings and stuff, it would be an effort to try to challenge what I call false dichotomies, where we have splits in our minds. That's a false dichotomy. So when we have that individual going off and we think we have to identify with the group, that's a false dichotomy, I'm going to argue. We have to find a way to be with the individual in the group. What Adriel's raising right now is, in my view, what might be considered a false dichotomy between process, or for my Canadian friends, process versus content. Understand? And I'm going to argue that when you get skillful at this, you begin to realize there is no difference between process and content. That in fact, the process that you're seeing in these support groups is directly related to the content. I will come back to it, Adriel, but for a quick illustrative example, you have someone, in a group that takes it off. I think that you were describing at that point, and is not hearing or listening or able to respond to the rest of the group. That could be one of the examples that, that you're concerned about. Step back for a second. What are you seeing in that process? What is that person showing you that is probably a significant content issue for discussion? Am I making sense? I mean, I'm watching your faces, what are they showing you, Adriel, when they go off onto these things and seem to ignore if there's anyone else in the room? Anybody, Adriel or anybody? What are they telling you about? Go ahead.
I mean, sometimes if that's happening, somebody is showing you the needs that they have. I mean, that's something that you're seeing is the needs that somebody has in that moment.
And they don't know how to get them met.
Yes.
Am I making sense?
Yeah,
Now,
and I think the concern that can come up there is like that balance between being with the individual and the group thing.
yeah, and I'm arguing you got to be with both. This is going to be you got to deal with processes, content, understand? And as that person acts that way, they are showing you an issue. Do you think the other members in the group also at times have difficulty when they try to deal with their problems with family or others? Yes, they do. They all do. So there is no distinction between the individual and the group. It's a false dichotomy. There is no distinction between, that's why when people say I'm doing a process group, I don't know exactly what that means, except that I did a lot of encounter groups when I went for my doctoral thing, and I managed to survive those. If those of you who know what I mean by encounter groups. So what I'm going to suggest is sometimes when you lead these groups with your students, your peers, when you see that process taking place, you ought to be stepping back and saying, what is this saying to me about the content of the group? And the example that Adriel just gave, I think, if I heard it right, is she's illustrating, or he is illustrating, how they don't know how to take help from other people, in effect. And so what they need some help with, in a real example, is how to reach out. Joe, you're sort of raising your problems, your concern, but whenever someone comes up with a suggestion, you seem to suggest that it's not going to be helpful. Is it hard for you to hear these suggestions? And how about the rest of you? Is it tough for you? You understand what I'm doing? I'm using the process because the process is the handle for getting the work done. Do I make some sense about false dichotomies? I think when you feel stuck at any point in your practice, you're probably stuck on a false dichotomy. Am I dealing with process versus content? Am I dealing with the individual versus the group? Am I making sense? Am I dealing with affect? All of these dichotomies, they trap you when you're stuck in them. And often we go back and forth. I've seen it so often. We identify with the individual because we think the group isn't being helpful, and so we're not with the group. Or we identify with the group, we've lost track of the individual. And what I'm suggesting, Adriel, we got to be looking at both. And that's where the structure comes. The structure comes from there. All right, look, I think we have a pretty good list of examples, don't you? Is anybody sitting there feeling that there's something they're concerned about in terms of leading the group or their past experience? Go ahead, Brandy. Go ahead.
So I just have a bit of a concern when it comes to virtual care in general. So I'm new to providing support over any type of telemental health or what we have as OTN. And I know one of the tenets is, being supportive and trustworthy, building that rapport with your peers. And is there concern or is there no concern around trying to do that in this type of form? Because I feel as though the only experience I have has been person to person, sitting in that environment. And I'm concerned I'm going to lose that in this type of situation.
Oh, wonderful issue, very appropriate for what's going on right now, because most of you, if you are going to be getting back doing your practice, maybe doing telehealth, or maybe working. What's your thoughts, briefly? What's your thoughts about that? Because I would take the position, at least my thought, is that I don't think there's any difference. I mean, I'm working as hard as I can right now to be empathic with you guys, to try to understand what you're saying, to help you elaborate. Hopefully, in the course of this 2 hours, to develop the kind of working relationship, which we think is important, but to try to do it over video. But it's no different. Trust. I got to create a situation where you trust, that you could share stuff and that I'm concerned about you and your thoughts and your struggles. Caring, that I care about you and what you're struggling with, not just about the students you're working with. That's part of relationship building. Am I making any sense at all? I actually think the working relationship is the same whether you're on video or whether you're not. You just have to realize all the same elements are true. They're just going to be a little bit more difficult. You have to work out how to handle it. People raise their hands and, when they talk over each other, or they don't have someone like Steve in the background so that your communication gets screwed up. So I've come to the conclusion that good practice is good practice, whether you're doing it over video. And again, Brandy, just like all the rest of this, you could always ask the client. You could always say to the client, I'm so used to talking to people personally about this, and this is a different way of speaking. How are you experiencing it? I will tell you right now that the research is showing that clients like telehealth once they get into it. They don't have to travel. They don't have to expose themselves and their families. There's a lot of research right now that's saying telehealth, communication over the video, is for some clients a preferred way of working. Isn't that amazing? So I think Brandy's raised a very important issue.